In 2016, the average Black American family had a total wealth of $17,600, about one-tenth the wealth of the average white American family, which stands at $171,000. Now, this gap leaves Black communities at a significant economic disadvantage. Dr. White has created an approach to advancing racial equity in entrepreneurship ecosystems that looks at creating dynastic wealth. LaTanya, can you explain exactly what dynastic wealth is and how it differs from generational wealth?
So, dynastic wealth is much more comprehensive. It's a much more holistic approach to wealth building and wealth transfer. It really comes down to not just transferring financial assets, which is the crux of generational wealth, but how do we ensure that we don't repeat this shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves tagline that we hear a lot in wealth transfer? And so that anecdote really talks about how the founding generation built their wealth, how they literally rolled up their shirt sleeves to build wealth. And this second generation were the beneficiaries of it, right? So they didn't have to work as hard. They had these more favorable conditions, more favorable opportunities, but they weren't really a part of how the wealth was created. So dynastic wealth really looks at who are we as a family? How did the founding entrepreneur in the family, what were their lived experiences that brought them to this place? How do I make sure to transfer that insight?
How can dynastic wealth help address systemic racism?
I love that we acknowledge that it is a systemic problem, that the inequities around economics and wealth and income are systemic. So there are actually five forms of wealth that are comprised of the dynastic wealth construct. Absolutely, financial wealth, which is essentially generational wealth. You can't build a dynasty without financial wealth. But then we move into spiritual wealth, which is really the identity of the family that I referred to earlier, going into this wealth of knowledge and then investing in intellectual wealth. The fifth form of wealth that is really comprised of the construct of dynastic wealth addresses your question almost head on, and that's relational wealth. That's looking at your social capital. It looks at not only how do we make sure that you get into the right room, but how do we ensure that you feel psychologically safe in that space, that you feel like you belong in that space so that you self actualize, so that you're able to perform at your highest level? Now, in order for us to create these psychologically safe spaces, that's when the real work begins. That's when we have to look at not only the policies and the programs, but the practices of the key executives, the leaders, and the policymakers that can create these more psychologically safe spaces where people do feel much more like they belong.
When we look at the founder's journey, what is the relationship between resilience and dynastic wealth when it comes to building a startup?
So, resilience, as we know it, grit, it's that stick to itiveness. In the scholarly community, is referred to as entrepreneurial persistence. And that persistence, how likely are you to continue to be committed to the business idea? It's almost a reflection. It has almost a direct correlation between your pre-exposure to entrepreneurship because it really kind of sets your expectations, right? Social media and pop culture make entrepreneurship look like the easiest thing. But most of us know that that's just the glitz and glam, and we never get to peek behind the emerald curtain. So when we're talking about dynastic wealth, we're talking about three generations. Now that is resilience if there was nothing else, but it also requires this deep level of commitment from an entrepreneurial grit perspective.
3 generations is a long time, so how do
Yeah.
you ask a young person to build something they might not benefit from?
Yeah. Such a great question. As I was interviewing the first generation founders for my doctoral research, the words, and they still move me so deeply. There were two or three of them that literally said, "I'm planting a seed, and I know I may never get the privilege of being around when the fruit bears. One of the things that I like to do when I'm working with college students is to really help situate their lived experience. What were the experiences that informed and shaped their own approach to the entrepreneurial journey? Was it out of necessity? Because it was just so hard for your parents or your community to make ends meet? Or was it out of opportunity where you had the skill, you were able to see that there's a trend developing and I want to get in front of it? And oftentimes for communities of color, it's out of necessity. And so if I can help students and young people really think about what has their lived experience been and how could your work as an entrepreneur create more favorable conditions for someone down the line, how impactful would that be to your decision making as an entrepreneur today? And that seems to land really well with that generation.
How do programs like the ones MindFrame Connect offers help entrepreneurs prepare them for success in the ecosystem?
So I have to preface this with a little bit about my identity. So I come to this experience working with MindFrame as an empath, as an introvert, as a first generation Black female founder. So bring all of that lived experience into, how I answer the question. A part of my experience, both in the classroom and as an entrepreneurship educator, where 99% of the entrepreneurs and founders that I've worked with are first generation and founders of color, I found overwhelmingly is the mindset. There's so much fear, doubt, and insecurity that surrounds the entrepreneurial journey, specifically for Black and Brown founders due to generational trauma. So we're familiar with low self esteem and high self esteem, but vacant esteem is the idea that I see that I lack worth. And so if I take that narrative into this entrepreneurial journey, I either never start, I'm very slow to start, or I do not take big enough risks. And so when we look at how entrepreneurship really affects the wealth narrative, access to opportunities, if that's how I begin my journey, then my levels of resilience are already weak. I already have a low pre-exposure to entrepreneurship. And so then it becomes this whole big mess, right? That if we can't begin with really addressing mindset, identity, and really that the inner narrative that a lot of entrepreneurs come into the journey with, some of the work that we're doing with Mindframe, with other projects, other programs, it won't be as impactful because we hadn't really gotten to the root issue.